The sky above was a canvas of stars, their cold light reflected in the metallic wreckage scattered across the alien terrain. Eric adjusted his breathing mask and scanned the horizon one more time. His ship had crash-landed hours earlier, leaving him stranded on this desolate world with little more than emergency rations and a damaged transmitter. Isolation was not new to him. Space exploration required resilience, but this felt different. It was too quiet. As he moved cautiously among the remains of his vessel, Eric's hand tightened around the grip of his multi-tool. The planet's red soil crunched underfoot, and the wind carried with it a whisper of unease. He was not alone. He could feel it. The hair on his neck stood on end. "Who's there?" he called out, the sound of his voice muffled by the mask. No response. Just the wind. Then a flicker of movement caught his eye, a shadow slipping behind a jagged rock formation. Heart pounding, Eric approached slowly, every instinct screaming at him to retreat. But curiosity and a lifetime of training in first contact protocols compelled him forward. "Show yourself," he demanded, trying to project calm authority. He raised his hands to show he meant no harm. A figure stepped into view, and Eric's breath caught in his throat. She was tall, with iridescent skin that shifted hues under the starlight, and eyes that glowed faintly. Her features were striking, almost ethereal, but there was nothing soft in her stance. She held a long, curved weapon, its edge glinting dangerously. They stared at each other for a long moment. Eric slowly lowered his hands. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice low but steady. He pointed to his ruined ship. "Crash. I'm stranded." The alien woman's eyes narrowed, her grip on the weapon tightening. She spoke, her words a melodic series of tones and clicks that Eric couldn't understand. She gestured at him, then at her own shipwreck, which lay crumpled and smoking a short distance away. "2 crashes, 1 planet. That's a hell of a coincidence," Eric muttered, more to himself than to her. He tried again, miming the crash with his hands. "You crash too." She watched him intently, then gave a small nod. Slowly, she lowered her weapon, though she kept it within reach. Eric exhaled, feeling some of the tension drain from his shoulders. "Okay, progress. Maybe we can figure this out together." He took a tentative step forward, and she did not move away. Encouraged, Eric pointed to himself. "Eric," he said, tapping his chest. The alien woman tilted her head, considering him. Finally, she pointed to herself. "Zola," she said, her voice softer now but still wary. "Zola," Eric repeated, letting the name roll off his tongue. He gestured at their surroundings. "We need shelter." Zola seemed to understand. She glanced at the darkening sky, then at the rocky outcrop nearby. With a curt nod, she motioned for him to follow. Together, they moved toward the outcrop, both acutely aware of the uneasy truce between them. The makeshift shelter offered some protection from the biting wind. Eric and Zola worked in silence, gathering rocks and debris to reinforce the structure. As they labored side by side, their wariness gradually gave way to a fragile sense of cooperation. Occasionally, their eyes met, and though neither spoke, there was a growing understanding, a mutual recognition of shared vulnerability. When the shelter was complete, they sat opposite each other, the flickering light of a small fire casting shadows on the walls. Eric rummaged through his survival pack and produced a small container of water. He took a sip, then offered it to Zola. She hesitated, eyeing him carefully before accepting. Their fingers brushed as she took the container, and for a brief moment her skin glowed brighter. "You're not so different, are you?" Eric said quietly, more to himself than to her. Zola's glowing eyes met his, and he wondered if she understood. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the wind. Eventually, Eric broke the quiet. "We need to find a way off this planet," he said, pointing first at himself, then at the sky. "Home." Zola's expression darkened, and she shook her head. She spoke in her own language, her words quick and sharp, but Eric could only guess at their meaning. She pointed at the remnants of their ships, then made a gesture that looked like an explosion. Damaged beyond repair, Eric guessed. But maybe not impossible? Zala stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a small device. She activated it, projecting a holographic display that filled the air with symbols and diagrams. Eric leaned forward, fascinated. "Is that your ship's schematics?" he asked, even though he knew she wouldn't understand. He pointed at the hologram, then at himself, trying to convey his willingness to help. Zala seemed to consider this. Finally, she nodded, tapping a section of the hologram and then gesturing toward him. It was a start. Over the next few hours, they worked together, studying the schematics and sharing what little they had in terms of tools and resources. Communication was limited to gestures and drawings, but it was enough. With each passing moment, the barriers between them grew smaller. As the fire crackled and the stars moved across the sky, Eric glanced at Zala. She was focused, her eyes scanning the hologram with a mix of determination and weariness. Despite everything, there was a strength about her that he couldn't ignore. "We'll find a way," he said softly, more a promise to himself than anything else. Zala looked up, meeting his gaze. For the first time, she smiled, a small, fleeting expression, but genuine. In that moment, Eric knew they had taken the first step toward something greater than mere survival. In this strange and hostile place, they had found an unexpected ally, and perhaps something more. The stars above continued to shine, indifferent to the struggles below. But for Eric and Zala, the journey had just begun. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, finding strength in their unlikely bond. Chapter 2. Mutual Need, Mutual Respect. Morning broke over the rocky terrain, painting the sky in shades of pale blue and crimson. Eric blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous day rushed back, and he turned his head to find Zala sitting cross-legged by the remnants of the fire, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The glow of her skin had dimmed in the cold light of dawn. "Morning," Eric said, stretching his sore muscles. Zala glanced at him, her expression unreadable, and then returned her attention to the horizon. Eric got to his feet, dusting off his pants. He walked over, careful not to make any sudden movements. "What are you looking for?" Zala didn't answer. Instead, she pointed at a distant rise of jagged rocks, her eyes narrowing. She spoke a series of melodic tones and clicks, but Eric could only catch the urgency in her tone. She mimed something falling from above and gestured toward their makeshift shelter. More debris, Eric guessed. Maybe supplies? Zala nodded, her movements quick and precise. She rose gracefully, slinging her weapon across her back. Eric picked up his own makeshift spear, a sharpened metal rod from the wreckage, and gestured for her to lead the way. As they walked, silence stretched between them, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. Eric cleared his throat. "You know, we're going to need more than gestures if we're going to survive here." Zala turned her head slightly, as if acknowledging his words, but she said nothing. They continued their trek in companionable silence until they reached the rise. The view from the top revealed scattered debris, fragments of both their ships strewn across the rocky landscape. Zala's eyes widened when she spotted a small, partially intact crate bearing the symbols of her people. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees and prying it open. Eric approached slowly, giving her space. When the crate opened, a faint glow emanated from within. "What did you find?" he asked, crouching beside her. Zala pulled out a cylindrical device, her expression one of intense relief. She tapped a sequence on its surface, and it emitted a soft hum. She spoke rapidly, the melodic tones rising and falling. Eric shook his head, frustrated by the language barrier. "Slow down," he said gently, pointing to himself and then to her. "I don't understand." Zala paused, exhaled, and held up the device. She pointed to herself, then mimed eating, drinking, and breathing deeply. Life support, Eric guessed, his eyes widening. Is it a purifier? She nodded, offering a small, rare smile. Yes, she said, the word thick with her accent but unmistakably clear. Eric grinned. Great. That's great news. He pointed to the device. Can it make more? More clean water, more air. Zala hesitated, then shook her head. She gestured, indicating a limited capacity. They would need to use it sparingly. All right, Eric said, his tone serious. It's still a step forward. We'll ration it. They worked together to secure the device, setting it up near their shelter to purify water from a small, murky stream they'd found. The process took hours, but by the time it was complete, they had a small supply of clean water, enough to last a few days if they were careful. As evening fell, Eric sat by the fire, turning a piece of scrap metal in his hands. We need to figure out food next, he said aloud, even though he knew Zala couldn't understand everything. He pointed to his mouth, then made a motion as if eating. Food. Zala considered his words, then stood and beckoned for him to follow. She led him to a rocky outcropping, where she knelt and began sifting through the soil. After a moment, she pulled out a root-like plant with a bioluminescent sheen. She sliced off a small piece with her knife and held it out to him. Eric raised an eyebrow. You want me to eat that? Zala nodded, taking a bite herself to show it was safe. She chewed slowly, then swallowed, her glowing eyes fixed on him. All right, Eric muttered, hesitantly taking the piece. He chewed cautiously, expecting the worst. To his surprise, the taste was earthy but not unpleasant. Not bad, he said, nodding appreciatively. They spent the next few hours foraging for more of the roots, building a small stockpile. As they worked, Eric noticed Zala's movements, quick, efficient, and always aware of their surroundings. He realized she was not just a diplomat, she was a survivor. You've done this before, he said, more to himself than to her. You know how to survive. Zala met his gaze, her expression softening. She pointed to herself, then made a gesture indicating a large group. She pointed at the sky and mimed a crash, then drew a line across her throat. You lost them, Eric said quietly. He nodded, understanding more than words could convey. I'm sorry. Zala looked away, but her shoulders relaxed. They stood there, two survivors bound by mutual loss and the need to keep moving forward. When they returned to the shelter, exhaustion pulled at their limbs. They ate in silence, the glow of the fire dancing in their eyes. Finally, as they prepared to rest, Eric spoke again. Thank you, he said, pointing to her and then to the purified water and gathered roots. Thank you for this. Zala nodded slowly, her gaze meeting his. She touched her chest and said, Zala. Eric smiled, touching his own chest. Eric. They repeated the names softly, as if committing them to memory. In that moment, the gap between their worlds felt a little smaller. Respect had grown out of necessity, and mutual need had given way to something more, a fragile but real connection. As they settled in for the night, Eric stared up at the stars, feeling a flicker of hope. They were two stranded beings on a hostile planet, but they were not alone. Together, they would find a way to survive, and perhaps to truly understand one another. Chapter 3. Learning the Other's World. The days blended together as Eric and Zala continued their survival efforts. The small shelter they had built from wreckage provided some protection against the planet's harsh winds, and the life support device kept them alive, though barely. Each day, they ventured farther to gather resources, carefully learning how to navigate this alien world. There was a rhythm to their life now, one that had developed quietly between them, a shared understanding that had no need for words. But Eric knew that to truly survive and thrive here, they would need to know more about each other's worlds. Their technology was primitive by their respective standards, but Eric had an idea. If they could communicate more effectively, they could find a way to repair Zala's ship and get off this desolate planet. One morning, as the two of them prepared for their daily routine, Eric decided it was time to try something different. He gestured to the small tablet he had salvaged from the wreckage and motioned for Zala to sit next to him. She looked at him curiously, a slight frown forming on her face. "You want to try something," Eric said, holding up the tablet. "We need to figure out how to talk to each other more clearly." Zala eyed the tablet warily but nodded, sitting beside him. She tilted her head as he tapped the screen, displaying a list of symbols and images that represented simple concepts. "This is from Earth," Eric explained. "I want to try and teach you our language." Zala's glowing eyes studied the symbols with an intensity that Eric couldn't help but admire. She pointed at the screen, then at him. "You teach?" He nodded. "Yes. And you teach me your language, too." He smiled. "Deal." Zala's lips twitched in the smallest of smiles, a rare but welcome sight. She nodded slowly. "Deal." They spent the rest of the morning trying to communicate. Eric would point to objects in their environment, saying the corresponding word in English. Zala would repeat it, her accent thick, but she tried, each attempt a small victory. Her pronunciation was difficult for Eric to understand at first, but as the day wore on, he started to make out the patterns in her speech. It was slow progress, but they began to communicate in basic ways. When Zala gestured toward the sky and said something that sounded like Yara, Eric repeated it. She nodded in approval and pointed upward, mimicking the action. "Yara?" Eric asked, gesturing to the sky. "Yara," Zala confirmed, her voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "Home." She made a motion with her hand, as though sweeping the vast expanse above them. "Home," Eric repeated thoughtfully, understanding the meaning behind the word. "Your home. Your world." Zala nodded again, and her expression softened. She pointed to herself, then to the ground, then out toward the horizon. "I am from Yara, a long way from here." Eric's heart sank. He could see the pain behind her words, and he wished he could offer her something more than just words. He reached out, placing a hand gently on her arm. "We're stuck here for now," he said softly, "but we'll find a way off. Together." Zala met his gaze, her eyes flickering with something. Maybe hope, or maybe a quiet acceptance of the circumstances. She placed her hand over his, holding it there for a long moment. Then, she broke the contact and turned back to the tablet. Zala tapped the screen, looking at him with a curious expression. "Earth," she said, her accent thicker as she pronounced the word. She mimed a motion of walking, then pointed to herself. "Earth," Eric confirmed, smiling. "Yes, that's where I'm from." He paused for a moment, then added, "It's far from here. But I can teach you about it." Zala's gaze softened again, and she seemed to consider this. She spoke a few more words in her native tongue, which Eric still couldn't fully understand, but it was clear she was offering something in return. "I'll learn about your world too," he said, his tone sincere. "You've already taught me about the sky and the stars. I want to know more." Zala's expression flickered for a moment before she nodded. She motioned toward the horizon, then made a sweeping gesture with her hands, as though trying to encompass something larger than their immediate surroundings. She spoke again, this time slower and more deliberate. "Yara," she said, emphasizing the word as she gestured to the sky and the ground around them. "Mountains. Oceans. Fields." Eric leaned in, trying to follow her words, trying to understand the language as best he could. "Mountains, oceans, fields?" he repeated, feeling a sense of wonder at the idea of her world, the way she described it. Zala nodded, her expression becoming more animated as she spoke. "Rivers. Cities. Lights." Eric could only imagine the beauty of her home. He pressed a hand to his chest, then pointed to her. "I want to see it. I want to see Yara." Zala's gaze softened, and for a moment she seemed to be lost in her thoughts. She turned away, her eyes distant, as though picturing a place that was beyond reach. "I cannot show you," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Not now." Eric reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "Someday, maybe. We'll find a way." Zala looked at him, her eyes still glowing faintly. She studied his face for a moment before nodding. "Someday." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was a new understanding between them, a shared longing for things they both lost. It was still early in their journey together, but it felt like they were beginning to move forward in the same direction. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, Eric and Zala sat together in their shelter, the fire crackling in front of them. Zala spoke of Yara again, this time with more certainty, her voice steady as she described her world's wonders, things she had once taken for granted. As she spoke, Eric couldn't help but notice the faint glow of her skin. It seemed to shine brighter with every word, every recollection of home. He wondered if she knew how much it hurt him to hear about the beauty of her world, knowing he would never see it himself. But he also knew that their bond, fragile as it was, had the potential to turn this lonely, harsh place into something more. It was in this silence, in the space between their worlds, that Eric realized something he hadn't fully grasped before. They weren't so different. They both had dreams, both had lost something precious, and both would do whatever it took to find a way forward. Together. Chapter 4. A Shared Language. The day started with the usual quiet. The wind carried the scent of the alien soil, and the sky above, always a mix of blue and purple, had the calming feel of the calm before a storm. Only there was no storm on the horizon. It was the kind of stillness that made Eric feel like he could sit forever, watching the distant rocks and hills, the quiet stretching around him. But there was work to be done. The shelter needed reinforcing, more resources had to be gathered, and most importantly, the slow but necessary task of communication had to continue. Over the past few days, Eric and Zala had established a basic understanding between them. But despite the progress with their shared words, there was still so much left unspoken, so much of their experiences and worlds that hadn't been shared. Eric was sitting on the edge of the shelter, working through some crude notes when Zala approached. She had been out earlier, gathering more of the bioluminescent roots they had been eating. Her movements were measured, graceful, and her sharp eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. It was something Eric had begun to appreciate about her, the way she always seemed to be aware of everything around them. "Zala," Eric called, standing up from his crouch. "I was thinking, we need to work on our language more. If we're going to get anywhere, we need to be able to talk, really talk." Zala tilted her head in understanding. "Talk?" she asked, her voice soft but confident. It was strange how, in just a few short days, they had gotten used to these tiny exchanges, despite the complexity of the different languages they were trying to communicate in. Eric smiled, a little embarrassed at how his words sounded. You know, more than just survival words. Like, the kind of words that explain our lives, our worlds. He gestured to the land around them. "This place, for example. There's a lot we don't know about it, but if we could talk more clearly, we could learn faster." Zala didn't respond immediately. She walked over to the shelter and sat down next to him, her movements measured, though there was an ease about her now. She gestured to the small fire they had started, then mimicked the action of speaking. "Words," Zala said thoughtfully, "not enough." She paused, her brow furrowing as she tried to find the right phrasing. "I will try." Eric nodded eagerly, the spark of excitement flickering in his chest. "Yes, exactly. Let's try." They began with the basics again. Eric pointed to himself, then to her. "Eric," he said, tapping his chest. Then he pointed to her. "Zala." Zala repeated his name, then pointed to him, saying "Eric," and then mimicked the action, tapping her chest. She tried to say his name with more precision this time, letting the syllables fall naturally from her mouth. "Good," Eric said, beaming at her. He then pointed at the sky, asking, What about that? Zala squinted up at the sky, her eyes thoughtful. Sky, she said slowly. Yara. Eric nodded, understanding the connection. Yara, he repeated, and added, my home. Zala tilted her head. Earth. Earth, Eric confirmed with a smile. That's where I'm from. My world. Zala's eyes glinted with interest. She pointed again to the horizon. Yara. My world. She paused. Lost. Eric's heart skipped a beat at the weight of her words. He reached out to her shoulder, touching it gently. I'm sorry, he said softly. I can't imagine what it's like to lose your home. Zala didn't flinch at his touch, and for a moment they just sat there, connected by the understanding of a shared pain. She smiled faintly, her expression softening. It's okay. We survive. Eric gave her a small nod and let the moment stretch out before speaking again. Survive, he echoed. We've been doing that, haven't we? Yes, she said, her voice steady. Together. They sat in silence for a few minutes before Eric stood up, motioning for Zala to follow. Come on, he said, reaching for the broken tablet. Let's try again. I think we can move past just the basics now. Zala stood and followed him to the makeshift table where the broken tablet lay. As she sat across from him, she met his eyes with a look of quiet determination. Eric worked through the tablet's remaining functions, flicking through a few simple illustrations to get her engaged. He then pulled up a series of symbols that represented more complex ideas. Family, home, friendship, trust. This, Eric pointed to a symbol of a small group of people, is family. Zala studied it carefully, then pointed to the symbol and said something that Eric didn't understand. He frowned slightly but didn't let it discourage him. Zala saw the confusion in his face and pointed at herself, then mimicked the gesture, placing her hand over her chest. Zala, she said, as if making an important point. Family, Eric repeated, then added, you? Zala nodded. Yes, she said with a small smile. Family. Then she made a motion indicating a distance, pointing at Eric with a questioning look. Are we family? Eric asked, confused by the sudden turn. Zala's smile grew, but her expression turned more serious. She placed a hand on her chest, then pointed to him. Family. In space. Eric's chest tightened as he understood what she was trying to say. They weren't blood, weren't from the same place, but in this strange, isolated world, they had come together. They had become something else entirely. Something that didn't fit neatly into the structures of home, or species, or planets. You and me, Eric whispered softly, then smiled. We are. Zala nodded, her eyes glowing slightly. Yes. We. Together. They both sat in silence for a while, the weight of their newfound connection settling between them. The wind whispered softly through the rocks outside, but in that moment it felt like the world had quieted for them. As the stars above began to shine, brighter and clearer than before, Eric took a deep breath and looked at Zala. You know, we may have a long way to go before we really understand each other. But I think this is a start. Zala reached out, placing her hand gently over his. Start, she echoed, and for the first time, there was no mistaking the warmth in her voice. Together, they had begun something, and Eric had the distinct feeling that their journey, whatever it might be, was just beginning. Chapter 5. When Shadows Fall. The planet's days were short, the sun sinking beneath the jagged mountains in less than 6 hours. By the time Eric and Zala returned to their shelter after another long day of scouring the barren landscape for resources, the world around them was bathed in the eerie, muted light of twilight. The quiet, so often welcoming during their routine, now felt a little too silent, too heavy. Eric had learned to read the signs. The air was still, unervingly still, and a dark cloud hung on the horizon. He glanced over at Zala, who stood next to him, her eyes narrowing as she studied the strange weather phenomenon. Her lips moved, speaking quickly in her native tongue. Eric caught fragments of the words: danger, storm, fury. Zola looked at him, her eyes flashing with urgency. "We need to go," she said in halting English, her accent thick. "Shelter. Now." Eric didn't hesitate. He motioned for her to follow, and they quickly moved toward their makeshift shelter. As they reached the entrance, the wind picked up, swirling dust and debris into the air. The sky darkened, a deep purple-black color creeping across the heavens. It wasn't like any storm Eric had seen on Earth. This was something different, something violent in its energy. Inside the shelter, Zola and Eric huddled by the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. The wind howled outside, rattling the structure. It wasn't much, but it had held up so far. Zola's gaze was distant, her features tense. She clenched her fists, looking as though she was listening for something. Perhaps to the storm, or perhaps to something deeper within herself. Eric had seen her like this before, when something stirred in her thoughts. "What's going on?" Eric asked, his voice soft, but urgent. "Zola, what do we do?" Zola turned to him, her eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. "We wait," she said simply, her voice low and firm. "The storm, it passes. But we must be ready." Eric was about to ask more when a deafening crash sounded from outside, like the sky itself had broken open. The shelter shook, and dust rained down from the ceiling. Eric grabbed onto the nearest support beam, holding on as the wind screamed against the walls. Zola's voice was barely audible over the howling wind. "Stay close. Do not go out." Eric nodded, his pulse quickening. He could feel the pressure of the storm against the shelter, the very ground trembling beneath them. Whatever it wasn't just a normal storm. It felt alive. He wondered how Zola knew so much about this planet's strange, dangerous forces. But she had never explained, and now was not the time for questions. Minutes felt like hours. The storm's fury raged outside, clawing at their shelter. Zola's gaze never wavered from the door, her body tense, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if she could feel the world outside through her fingertips. Eric wanted to speak, to offer comfort, but he found himself just as still, rooted in place by the force of the storm. Finally, the wind began to subside. The terrifying howls softened to a low hum. Slowly, the storm passed, the air outside settling into a deep, heavy silence. Zola exhaled sharply and relaxed her grip on the table. "It's over," she whispered, but her voice still carried the weight of caution. Eric let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "That was insane," he said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "What was that?" Zola stared at the now quiet sky, her expression unreadable. "A cleansing storm," she said, her voice distant. "It happens sometimes. Forces of nature, guided by the planet's energy. We are lucky it passed quickly." Eric's mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything he had just witnessed. But there was something more pressing on his mind. He looked at Zola, noticing the way her shoulders slumped in relief, and yet there was something else, a quiet sadness in her eyes. "Zola," Eric began, his voice soft, "what did you mean earlier? About the planet's energy? You've mentioned it before, but I don't understand." Zola didn't answer immediately. She stared into the fire for a long while, the flames dancing in her reflective eyes. Finally, she spoke. "My people, we are deeply connected to the worlds we inhabit. Our cities, our lands, they pulse with energy. We feel it. It guides us, it shapes us." Eric remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "When the storm comes, it is the planet reminding us," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "that we are not in control, that we are just visitors. The storm is not meant to hurt us. It is meant to show us, to show me, that I cannot return to what was. My world is lost to me now." Zola's words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Eric's heart ached for her. He had known she carried the pain of losing her home, but hearing her speak of it so openly was something different. It was raw, vulnerable. You've lost so much, Eric said quietly, his voice filled with sympathy. Zala nodded, a faint shimmer of tears glistening in her eyes. I have, she said softly. And the storm. It is a reminder that I am not who I was. Not anymore. Eric reached out, his hand hovering uncertainly before resting gently on her shoulder. She stiffened at first but then relaxed into his touch, her body warming beneath his palm. The gesture was simple, but the connection was undeniable. She was not alone. They were in this together. I'm sorry, Eric said, his voice thick with emotion. I can't pretend to know what you're going through. But, if you need to talk, if you need anything, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Zala turned her head, meeting his gaze. The tension that had clouded her expression lifted, if only slightly. I know, she said softly, her voice holding a note of gratitude. Thank you, Eric. They sat there in silence, the fire crackling between them, the night finally settling into a fragile calm. The storm had passed, but something had shifted between them. The shared understanding, the shared silence, the shared vulnerability. It was a bond neither had anticipated, but both had found themselves deeply invested in. I'll help you, Eric said, breaking the silence once more. We'll rebuild. Together. Zala nodded slowly. She looked at the small, damaged communicator in her hands, then back at Eric. Together, she echoed, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. And for the first time since they'd crash-landed on this strange, hostile world, Eric felt like there was a chance. A chance for something more than just survival. A chance for something that, perhaps, neither of them had fully realized they needed. Chapter 6. In the Space Between Us. The air was thick with tension as Eric and Zala worked on repairing the last of the equipment they had salvaged from the wreckage. The storm had passed, leaving the sky clear and the world quiet, but there was something else in the air, something unspoken between them. After weeks of sharing the same space, surviving together, they had reached a turning point. A shift that neither of them had expected, but both could feel. The flickering light of the fire illuminated the inside of the shelter, casting long shadows on the walls. Eric was hunched over the last piece of the broken communication device, trying to figure out how to make it work, but his mind kept drifting to Zala. She had been quieter than usual today, her gaze distant as she worked beside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them during the storm, something that wasn't just about survival anymore. Zala, he said, his voice breaking the silence. She didn't look up right away, but when she did, her eyes were guarded, as if she were holding something back. Yes, she replied softly, her voice carrying an undercurrent of uncertainty. Eric hesitated, unsure of how to phrase the question that had been on his mind for days. I've been thinking about how far we've come since we landed here, how we've survived, and how we've started to understand each other. But there's something else, something I can't ignore. Zala's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes unreadable. She shifted slightly, and for a moment Eric thought she might get up and walk away, but instead she remained still. What do you mean? She asked quietly, her voice almost a whisper. She didn't meet his gaze, instead focusing on the broken piece of equipment in front of her. I mean, Eric paused, trying to find the right words. I mean that we're not just surviving anymore. We're connecting. In ways I didn't expect. Zala took a deep breath and finally met his gaze. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't speak. There was something raw in her look, something he couldn't quite place, but it pulled him closer. We're not just surviving, Zala, Eric continued, his voice softening. I can feel it. The way we've come to rely on each other. The way we've learned to understand each other without words. It's more than just being stuck on this planet. Zala's expression flickered, as though she were struggling with something. She stood up suddenly, pacing a few steps away, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. I don't know what you want from me, Eric, she said, her voice shaky. I've lost everything. My world, my people. And now I'm here, stuck with you, with no way to go back. What more is there to say?" Eric felt his heart tighten at her words. He stood up, taking a step toward her, but he didn't want to push her too hard. "I'm not asking for anything, Zala. I'm just saying, I care about you. More than just as someone I'm stuck with. You're important to me. You've become important to me." Zala's eyes flashed with something fierce, but she didn't move away. "I don't know how to deal with this," she said, her voice tight. "I've been alone for so long. And now you come here, and we survive together, and everything starts to change. But I can't just let go of the past, Eric. I can't forget what I've lost. I can't let myself get attached again." Eric closed the distance between them, his chest tight. He gently placed his hand on her arm, his fingers trembling. "Zala, I'm not asking you to forget. I'm not asking you to pretend your world never existed. But I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." Zala's gaze softened, and she looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up into his eyes. There was a long silence before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be close to anyone anymore," she admitted, the words heavy with pain. "I don't know how to open up, to let someone in." Eric's heart ached at her vulnerability. He didn't have the words to make this easier for her, but he didn't need to. He simply stepped closer, his other hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "You don't have to be alone anymore, Zala. Not if you don't want to be." Zala closed her eyes, her lips trembling slightly. She didn't say anything, but the tension in her body eased just a little. Eric felt her breath catch as she seemed to struggle with something inside her. "Why?" she asked, her voice raw with emotion. "Why do you care about me? Why after everything? Why me?" Eric took a deep breath, his own heart pounding in his chest. "Because we're both here, alone. Because we're surviving together. Because we've learned to trust each other. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as just someone I'm stuck with. I started seeing you as someone who matters to me. Not just because we're here together, but because of who you are." Zala's eyes softened, and for the first time since they had met, Eric saw something close to hope flicker in her gaze. She didn't say anything, but she didn't pull away either. Instead, she stepped forward, her body slightly trembling, and met his gaze fully. Slowly, Eric leaned in, and without a word, their lips met. It was tentative at first, but the moment their mouths touched, everything between them shifted. The kiss was soft, exploratory, as if they were both trying to understand what this connection truly meant. When they pulled back, neither of them spoke right away. They simply looked at each other, their faces close, their breath mingling. Zala's eyes were wide, as if she had never expected this moment, never expected to feel this way again. "Maybe this is the first step," Eric said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe this is where we start." Zala didn't respond right away, but after a long moment, she nodded. Her gaze softened, and the faintest of smiles tugged at the corner of her lips. "Maybe it is," she said quietly. And for the first time since they had crash-landed on this strange world, Eric felt like they were no longer just surviving. They were beginning something new, something that, despite the pain of their pasts, could be something worth holding on to. As they sat together in the quiet warmth of their shelter, the stars outside shining down on them, Eric realized that in the space between their worlds, they had found something that neither of them had expected, a chance for connection, a chance to heal, together. Chapter 7. Messages from Beyond. The days had begun to blur together in a way that Eric had never experienced before. Time had become a mere concept, no longer marked by the rhythms of his old life. Here, on this alien planet, the simple act of surviving was all-consuming. Yet, despite the chaos of their circumstances, something had changed between him and Zala. The connection they shared had deepened in ways that neither of them had anticipated. Zala had become more than just a fellow survivor. She was a partner, a constant presence in his thoughts. The way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she looked at him, it all had meaning now, beyond survival. And Eric could feel it. But there was something else that had been weighing on him, something that he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. He stood near the entrance of their shelter, gazing out at the vast, barren landscape. The wind had died down, and the quiet had returned, but it felt different now. There was an odd sense of tension in the air, an anticipation. Zala approached him from behind, her footsteps light but purposeful. She had been quieter these past few days, her eyes often distant, as if lost in thought. "Eric," she said softly, her voice tinged with something that made him turn around. "There's something I need to show you." He turned fully toward her, his brow furrowing in curiosity. "What is it?" Zala's face was more serious than he had ever seen it. She didn't say anything more, but instead, she stepped over to the table where the small, battered communication device they had been working on lay. Eric followed her, his pulse quickening with a mix of excitement and apprehension. She didn't waste time. Her fingers moved swiftly over the device, activating the worn screen. The holographic display flickered to life in front of them, casting an ethereal glow on Zala's face. The symbols danced across the air, and for the first time, Eric saw something more than just broken bits of equipment. The patterns began to form into a coherent image, one he recognized. "It's a signal," Eric said, his voice quiet but laced with disbelief. "A message." Zala nodded, her eyes locked on the screen. "I received it," she said simply. "From my people." Eric's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced, trying to process the significance of what she had just said. "Your people? You mean you're not alone?" "There's a chance." "Yes," she interrupted him, her voice steady but filled with a quiet sadness. "There's a chance. But I don't know if they can reach me. I don't know if they can even find me." Eric stepped closer, his hands hovering over the device. "Zala, this is huge. We need to respond. We need to—" "I know," she said, cutting him off again, this time with more force. "But I've been alone for so long, Eric. I've been on this planet, surviving, waiting. And now, the chance to return. But I don't know what that means. I don't know if I want to go back anymore." Eric's heart sank at the raw vulnerability in her voice. He stepped toward her, gently taking her hand in his. "Zala, whatever happens, you're not alone. Not anymore. We've been through this together. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I care about you. I'm not going anywhere." Zala's eyes glistened in the dim light of the shelter, but she didn't pull away. She held his gaze for a long moment before speaking again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've thought about this, thought about what it would mean to leave, to go back. But everything's different now. You're here, and I don't know what I would do without you." Eric's heart tightened at her words, but he didn't know how to respond. He simply squeezed her hand, silently offering the support he knew she needed. He understood. He had his own doubts, his own uncertainties about their future. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, his voice firm with determination. "Together." They stood there for a moment, letting the words sink in. Then, Zala finally let go of his hand and moved back to the device. She adjusted a few settings, bringing up a series of symbols and characters that Eric couldn't decipher, but he could tell they meant something important to her. "This is a message," Zala said, her voice steady. "A chance for me to return home. I have to decide, Eric. I can't ignore it." "I get it," Eric said, his voice low. He moved to stand beside her, watching the screen as the message played out before them. It was full of garbled static and fragmented words, but there were a few phrases that were clear enough for Eric to understand. "Zala, I don't know what this means for you, but I'm here. I'm with you. No matter what you choose." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the screen. I don't want to leave you. I don't want to go back to a world that doesn't exist anymore. But I have to know if there's any chance of survival for my people. If there's any hope left." Eric felt the weight of her words, the gravity of what she was saying. It wasn't just about returning to her home. It was about whether there was a future for her people at all. Whether there was any hope left for them. "You don't have to decide right now," Eric said gently, his voice soft. "We have time. You don't have to do this alone." Zala turned to face him, her expression softening, though there was still that quiet sadness in her eyes. "I don't know if I can go back, Eric. I don't know if I can leave everything we've built here. What we've become. We'll figure it out," he repeated, his voice steady and warm. "You don't have to make any decisions today. We have time." The quiet of the shelter stretched around them as the message from Zala's people continued to play out. It was unclear, distant, but it was a connection, a lifeline that she had clung to, even if she wasn't sure what it meant anymore. Zala sighed deeply, finally turning away from the screen. "I don't know what's worse, Eric, the thought of never seeing my people again, or the thought of leaving you." Eric stepped closer to her, his hand finding hers once again. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him then, her eyes filled with uncertainty but also something else, something softer. "You're right. We'll face whatever comes next together." They stood there for a long time, the sounds of the message continuing to play in the background. The stars outside shimmered, distant and silent, as if watching them, waiting for the next move. And in that moment, Eric knew one thing for sure. Whatever Zala chose, whatever her people decided, he would be there. He would face whatever came next with her, in the space between their worlds, as they continued to build something neither of them had ever expected. Together. Chapter 8. A Parting and a Promise. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the landscape as Eric sat on the edge of the shelter, his legs stretched out in front of him. The air was crisp, cool from the night's chill, and the faint smell of the fire lingered in the air. He was waiting for Zala, who had stepped out earlier, her mind clearly preoccupied by the message from her people. She hadn't said much since they'd spent the night discussing it. Eric had given her space, knowing how much she was wrestling with the decision she had to make. But he couldn't help but feel the weight of it. Time was running out. They couldn't stay on this planet forever. As he stared at the distant hills, Eric's thoughts drifted to everything they had been through. The storms, the struggle for survival, the shared moments of vulnerability. And through it all, Zala had become more than just a partner in survival. She had become someone he cared for deeply, someone who had started to mean more to him than he had ever expected. The soft sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find Zala approaching, her figure silhouetted against the rising sun. She was still wearing the same worn, practical clothes, but there was something about the way she walked now, something that was different from the first time they met. She moved with purpose, and yet there was an underlying hesitance in her every step. Zala stopped a few feet away from him and lowered herself to sit beside him. They both stared ahead, the silence between them comfortable, but heavy with unspoken words. Eric finally spoke, his voice gentle. "Have you decided?" He had to ask, though he already had an inkling of the answer. Zala didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the horizon, her eyes distant. "I don't know," she said after a long pause. "It feels like there's no right choice anymore. Every part of me wants to go home, to see my people again, to feel like I'm not alone in the universe. But another part of me doesn't want to leave this." She glanced at him, her expression softening. "Doesn't want to leave you." Eric's chest tightened at her words. He had known that this day would come, but hearing it from her lips made it all the more real. He wanted to reach out, to tell her that it was okay, that he would understand, but he knew she had to make this decision for herself. "I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between me and your people, Zala," Eric said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. I can't make that decision for you. But I do know that, whatever you decide, you're not alone. I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere." Zala's eyes glistened, but she quickly wiped away the tear that had escaped down her cheek. "It's not about you, Eric. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to leave, but—" "But you don't want to stay either," Eric finished for her, his voice soft with understanding. "I get it. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about who you are, where you belong." She nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the decision was too much to bear. "I've never had to choose before. I've never had someone else to think about. It's always just been me, surviving on my own. But now it feels like there's something more to consider. Something I can't ignore." Eric reached out, gently placing his hand on hers. It was a simple gesture, but it held more meaning than words could ever express. "Zala, you don't have to make this decision alone. You never have to be alone again." Zala looked at their hands, then back up at him, her eyes searching his face. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she leaned forward, her face inches from his, and for a moment Eric thought she might pull away. But then she closed the gap, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was soft, tentative, but full of the emotion that had been building between them for weeks. When they finally pulled away, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The air between them was thick with the understanding that had been growing, a shared intimacy that went beyond their physical connection. It was the bond that had been forged between them through the trials they had faced together. Zala's voice was quiet, almost hesitant as she spoke. "I don't know what to do, Eric. I don't know if I can go back. But I also don't want to leave you behind." Eric swallowed hard, his throat tight. He didn't have an answer for her, not the perfect one, anyway. He could tell her that she didn't have to go, that they could make a life here, on this strange planet. He could ask her to stay. But that wasn't fair to her. Zala had a past, a future that wasn't tied to this place, this world. He couldn't ask her to give that up. "You don't have to choose me over them, Zala," Eric said softly. "But you need to make the choice that's right for you. And whatever happens, we'll find a way to make it work. Together." Zala looked down at their hands, a faint, sad smile tugging at her lips. "I don't want to leave you. But I need to know if there's a future for my people. I can't ignore them forever." Eric nodded, understanding the pull of her responsibility. He could never ask her to abandon her world, her people. And yet, the thought of losing her, of her leaving alone, was something he wasn't ready to face. The sound of a distant signal interrupted the moment, a faint beeping coming from the damaged communicator. Zala's eyes widened. She stood up abruptly, moving toward the device with a sense of urgency that Eric couldn't ignore. "It's them," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "They've sent another message." Eric stood up as well, walking over to her. Zala's hands moved quickly, adjusting the settings on the device. The screen flickered, and then the message came through in a burst of static, the symbols now clearer, though still difficult to read. Zala took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the message. "They're offering to send a ship. They've found a way to get to me." The weight of her words settled in the room like a heavy fog. Eric's heart clenched, knowing what this meant. Zala had to decide. There was no more time to wait. Zala turned to him, her face a mixture of sadness and determination. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'll come back. I'll find a way." Eric didn't know what to say. He just nodded, stepping forward and wrapping his arms around her tightly. He didn't want to let go, didn't want to lose her, but he knew it was the right choice for her. And he couldn't stand in the way of that. "Come back," he whispered into her ear. "I'll be here, waiting for you." Zala pulled away, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She looked at him one last time, then turned toward the communicator, her hand lingering on the console. With one final glance over her shoulder, she stepped toward the entrance of the shelter. Eric watched her go, the silent promise hanging in the air between them. As the stars above twinkled in the vast expanse of the night, Eric stood there, waiting for the future to unfold. Whatever happened next, he knew that they had shared something that could never be taken away. The space between their worlds had been bridged, and in that space, something real had taken root. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Eric knew one thing for sure. No matter where Zala's path took her, their bond would remain.